Voices of the Bosnian Genocide is an organization that came together about 5 years ago. Our mission is to raise awareness about the Bosnian Genocide and to inform others about the dangers of intolerance, hatred, and discrimination. As people who are fortunate enough to survive the war in Bosnia, we know firsthand what discrimination looks like in all its forms. We know what it takes for neighbors, colleagues, co-workers, and even friends to become genocidal maniacs almost overnight. That's what happened in Bosnia. One weekend, we were sitting in our homes, roasting lamb, and sharing it joyfully with our neighbors and friends. The next weekend, we were being slaughtered like lambs by many of those same neighbors who had secretly armed themselves and began sniping and shelling at us in our own homes and neighborhoods. Today, we are going to explore and discuss this topic, and we are going to learn about the rich and colorful history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is an honor to introduce one of the world's leading experts on the subject of the Bosnian Genocide and one of the trustees of VOBG, Irfan Mirza. Irfan is an acclaimed author who has received 2 international writing awards. He is a recurring lecturer at Sonoma State University in California, where his lectures are part of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program of the California State University system. Since 2005, Irfan has been on the Board of Trustees of the Advisory Council for Bosnia and Herzegovina in Washington, D.C. The Council plays a critical role in advising congressional and Senate leaders in the U.S., as well as the State Department, on policy relating to Bosnia and Herzegovina. From 1992 to 1994, Irfan crisscrossed front lines of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina to deliver humanitarian aid. Through his work, he reached many besieged towns and villages that were under intense fire, where he helped people who were in need. During the war, he was an advisor to the United Nations, and in 1995, he provided critical consultation to a key advisor of President Bill Clinton. Irfan has 2 important books coming out on Bosnia: The History of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we are about to hear his lecture, which is based on that book, and his second book, a college text entitled A Framework to Understand the Bosnian Genocide. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Irfan Mirza.
Well, assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. It is an honor to be here and to address you and to talk to you about Bosnia tonight. I want to thank MAPS for organizing this event, and to the Bosnian community for helping support this organization of young people. So let's give everybody a little bit of time to settle down. I think everybody's still excited about the event and people are still coming in. So if you just give us a minute. Okay. So let's start by talking about the goals for tonight. I have 2 goals that I want to share with you, 2 things that we are going to try to accomplish. The first goal is to share information about Bosnia, right? We're going to talk about the history of Bosnia, we're going to talk about the war, we're going to talk about its present state, and we're going to talk about the future. That's sharing information about Bosnia. The second goal that we have tonight, it's probably a more important goal. It's the goal to create a platform from which the young people in this community can springboard, can leap forward to do work on behalf of the community. This facility, you being in the audience, the projector, the microphones, all of the infrastructure that we have available today, this is a springboard. How many of you watched the Olympics this year, the Summer Olympics? Right? Just about everybody. Do you remember seeing the people who did vault? Right? They would go on the springboard, they would jump on it, and then the springboard would catapult them, right? To go farther, to go higher. Well, that's what this is. This platform is intended for the young people. And you're about to see them on the panel, and they're going to come today, and they're going to talk about the present state of Bosnia and about its future. Okay? So we said there are two goals today. One is to share information on Bosnia, and the second is to create a platform for young people in our community so that they can spring forward and learn about public speaking. You saw today Alisa. She had a chance to come to the microphone. You see our hostess, Esma. They have a chance to come and speak to you, to grab your attention, to learn what it takes to do that. That's the platform that we've created here. Okay, so now that we're clear about that, let's go on to the topic at hand, which is the history of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So how old do you think Bosnia is? Let's start there. Somebody tell me how old you think Bosnia is, not the Bosnians, okay? 4,000 or 5,000 years, somebody says. Anybody else? Yes? Go ahead, our Imam is going to speak. 1,000 years old, okay. Anybody else? Any other guesses? Yes? 24 years. Wow, that's an interesting number. Why would he say 24? Well, if you go back 24 years, what year is it? It's 2016. Go back 24, takes us to 1992. Most people learned about Bosnia in 1992, didn't they? That was when we saw the war start, and we realized that there's a country named Bosnia-Herzegovina. But before that, in 1984, Sarajevo, the capital city of Bosnia, held the Olympics, the Winter Olympics. So maybe people think, well, Bosnia might be going back to 1984, but in 1984, Bosnia was in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So we don't know it as a country back then. So the whole question of how old is Bosnia has become a very important question. Because the basis of the war in 1992 was that Bosnia is really a part of Yugoslavia, and therefore it should not exist as a country. Brother here said it's 4,000 years old. Somebody said it was 1,000 years old. Well, let's talk about how old Bosnia really is. The very first humans in Europe, do you know when man walked in Europe? It was 45,000 years ago. 45,000 years ago, descendants of Adam, or evolutionary Adam, or biblical Adam, it doesn't matter which one you prefer, walked from the Horn of Africa up into Europe. And they walked through Bosnia-Herzegovina. 45,000 years ago, Bosnia had started a tourism industry. The migration of man into Europe. From Andalus, from Spain, Neanderthal man had come into Europe. Modern day man, Cro-Magnon man as we call it, walked up through Anatolia and through Bosnia-Herzegovina. So those were the very first people that went through Bosnia. And then what happened? The Ice Age came. 2/3 of Europe froze. It was under layers and layers of ice and snow. People didn't have food. All of Europe was frozen, well, almost all. The humans who were living there followed the animals, because that was their primary source of food. So where did they go? Well, they went in 3 directions. One group went east, another group went west, and the last group went south. The group that went south actually followed the Dinaric Alps, which are in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they landed in the valleys. They ended up in the valleys of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The group that went east, they went finally east to the Atlantic, almost to the Atlantic, to the North Sea, and then they went north. They ended up in Scandinavia. And then the group that went west, well, they ended up in the Caucasus Mountains in the Ukraine. So the very first place that the European man in Europe took refuge, one of them was Bosnia-Herzegovina. Okay? In the Paleolithic Era, we're talking about 12,000 years back, Bosnia-Herzegovina has evidence, archaeological evidence, of carvings in caves that date back, radiocarbon date back about 12,000 years. And these carvings indicate, you'll see, let me see if I can point it out. You'll see here the shape of a horse. This is actually the tail of the horse. Here, his flank. And the horse is being shot with arrows. Okay? So what happened was these nomadic tribes that came from Europe went to Bosnia, and if several things came together for them. Geology and geography played in their favor because Bosnia is surrounded by mountains on one side, the sea on the other, and the Drina River on yet another. So the animals that escaped to Bosnia were trapped. They were trapped in a state about the size of Washington State. They couldn't really go anywhere. And so when the humans came to hunt them, they didn't have to go very far to hunt. They actually had to travel very little. So the Bosnians, the very first humans in Bosnia, were able to establish settlements. They lived in caves, but these are among the earliest settlements in all of Europe. We see in Bosnia nomadic hunter-gatherers becoming settlers. One of the first settlements in Europe you will find is in Bosnia-Herzegovina. In this particular place, a town called Stolac. It's in Herzegovina, and there's a village near Stolac, it's called Borojevići, and this particular cave where these drawings are is called Pećina Badanja. So you have a chance to see how early settlements started in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Then came what we call the Mesolithic Era. This is in between sort of when Iron Age started and what we call typically when people lived in cave dwellers. During the Mesolithic Era, Europe was very busy trying to establish, European tribes were busy trying to establish land grab for themselves. Right? The ice was melting. They had an opportunity to settle in places. And so what did they find? They found that there was a contention for power. But in Bosnia, they were isolated. Remember the mountains, those Dinaric Alps I talked about earlier? They isolated the Bosnians from this warfare that was going on in Europe. The Bosnians lived in relative harmony. They started creating communities. They had plenty of food, lots of fresh water. So in the Mesolithic era, Bosnians transitioned from caves to simple wooden dwellings. Okay? And the wooden dwellings were built close to each other, and they formed what we call today neighborhoods. Right? The whole idea of neighborhoods, Bosnia was one of the first to actually have it. Then came the Neolithic era. There's this very famous pottery in Bosnia. It's known as the Butmir vase. Butmir is the town where today modern-day Sarajevo airport can be found. These vases go back between 7,000 and 10,000 years. And this is very important pottery because it describes a culture. It describes a community of people, communities of people in many different towns who had shared with each other artistic traditions, culture, religion. And so in that time, what the Bosnians had done is they had established for themselves relationships among the communities in Visoko, in Kaknja, and in Butmir. And as far away on the other side of Bosnia, a place called Kočičeva, which is close to a town today known as Banja Luka. These four very early communities had actually formed a union. At the time that this was happening, to give you some perspective, Rome had a population of 7,000 people. Hey, Rome was a village at the time that these Bosnian communities had created relationships with each other. So when we ask the question of how old is Bosnia, you really need to think about how old it is. The question is not so easy to answer. These communities established relations with other communities along the Adriatic Sea. We know that because in the archaeological excavations, we found seashells. So they had actually an economic system that they had established that allowed them to trade. Right? This is actually a dig in a place called Okolište. This dig was conducted by my professor from UCLA, Maria Gimbutas. She had gone there in 1976. And what Maria had discovered was that Bosnians exchanged traditions and they engaged in trade. She said they had created a regional identity. In other words, they formed a union like a small nation. So if you want to know when was Bosnia a nation, it was about 7,500 years ago. You weren't too far away. 4,000 years on the millennial scale of things, you were very close. All those who said 1,000 years. So to the young man's answer here, about 24 years ago, Bosnia was created as a modern nation state, recognized by the United Nations, separated from Yugoslavia. We asked the question earlier, why is the history of this country so important? I'll tell you, it's important because today what's happening in Bosnia is actually a result of the history. Over the centuries and over the millennia, Bosnia's history, as is the history of all countries that have been occupied, has been manipulated. It's been distorted by the occupiers. And this is the reason that today a lot of Bosnians ask themselves, well, we don't know how old our country is. Those of you who come from India and Pakistan, you have a very good idea of what colonialism is. Those of you who come from the Middle East, those of you who come from Africa, a lot of countries. And what the colonists, what the colonial powers have done, the occupiers, the invaders of nations, is they've distorted the history to make sure that the sense of identity of the people that they are occupying is eroded. If you don't have an identity, you are prone to manipulation. I can now manipulate you. I can say to you, oh, you are a second-class citizen in your own country. You are a migrant here. You don't have all of the rights that I have as a native here. Right? Bosnians there was a genetic study that was done in 2004 by a man by the name of Dr. Peter Underhill. He and his colleagues took 16,000 blood samples, and they found that there was a genetic marker, this mitochondrial DNA, that identified the Bosnians as the very first natives of Europe. The very first natives. What the Cherokee are to America, Bosnians are to Europe. Most Bosnians don't know this. And when they discover it, they say, oh, now I know why my grandparents used to tell me this and this and this. Right? Over the years of being occupied, the fact that the Bosnians were among the first people to walk in Europe, their descendants are natives of Europe, that fact has been wiped out, manipulated, distorted by everybody who's occupied Bosnia. Right? The purpose of it is to make sure the Bosnians don't have a sense of identity, that they don't have a sense of belonging, that they don't have a sense of entitlement. And if you don't have entitlement, meaning if you don't feel like you deserve to be in a country, well, your country can be taken away from you, can't it? And we'll get to talking about that, and we'll talk about how that came. Let's talk a little bit about Indo Europeans. These are my people, I like to say. So Indo Europeans are people who came from Iraq, Iran, India. It's a class of people who were nomads. They traveled through all of Asia and Europe. And when they came to Bosnia, they saw these people living near flowing water. So what name did they give them? They gave them the name people who live near flowing water. The word in the Indo-European language for flowing water is the word bash. The word bash over time evolved into the word bas. And from that, Bosnia has two of its most famous rivers named, the Vrbas River and the river Bosna or Bosna. So it was the Indo-Europeans who identified a group of people that lived near flowing water and gave them the name of people who live near flowing water. The Iron Age came. This is a very important time because during the Iron Age, archaeologists and genetic scientists have both been able to establish that there is a group, what's known as a haplogroup. This is like a genetic subgroup of people who live in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Scandinavia that are related to each other. These are the descendants of the very first natives, humans that walked in Europe. This group is known as IM170. In genetic science, they give letters to everything: A, B, C, D, H, I, J, K. Bosnians happen to be part of that mitochondrial group that falls in the letter I. And within that group, what they found is that the Bosnian female DNA actually went through the least amount of change of all of the DNA in Europe. Now you have to ask yourself why that's the case, right? And the genetic scientists were not able to explain it. But archaeology and history does. And so we're going to go explore that a little bit in a minute. But in the Iron Age, this group came together, this genetic group, and they spoke a language that was known as Paleo-Slavonic. It's a very, very old language. It doesn't exist anymore. And that language took stronghold in that group because all of these people were somehow related to each other. They had a genetic affinity. They were distant cousins of each other, you might say. So they had developed a lot of trust. They developed a lot of common traditions. And through that, they acquired each other's language. Okay? Then we have the dawn of civilization, as they say, the pre-Roman era. Okay? Many groups came to Bosnia. Among them were the Illyri, what are today mostly Albanian people. They tried to invade Bosnia and they tried to occupy it. Then came the Romans, not after Bosnia, but after the Illyri. The Romans were trying to contend with this growing Illyri empire. And so they started having battles with each other. Over 500 years, the Romans and the Illyri fought. And guess where Bosnia was in all that time? Between these two global powers fighting for contention of Europe. Bosnia was the meat in the middle of the sandwich between the Illyri and the Romans. Here's the interesting fact for you, okay? And I'm going to put a bunch of facts together and then ask you to figure out why these things work the way they do. The Romans ruled Bosnia for 400 years, yet today, in the Bosnian language, we only find 3 Latin words, no more. How is it possible that a power like Rome can rule a nation like Bosnia and not have the Bosnians absorb their language? In contrast, the Romans ruled the Illyri for 300 years, and the Illyri have adopted all kinds of Latin constructs in their language. So we're going to answer that question also. Okay? There was a group in Europe known as the Avars. The Avars were well advanced of the rest of man on Europe because they could actually wage war on the back of a horse. They were equestrian warriors. The Avars waged war all over the place. They were defeated by the Turks in the Caucasus Mountains, and so they moved to an area called Pannonia. Pannonia is today sort of where Romania is. And from that base, they started attacking the Goths. They attacked the Slavs, the Sclaveni people. And so when they attacked the region around what's known today as the Balkans or the Yugoslavia, the Sclaveni people that were living there took refuge. They went to Bosnia. And the first wave of Slav people that came to Bosnia actually are these South Slavs known as Sclaveni, who were escaping from the invasion of the Avars. The Avars actually were quite brutal in their invasion. They took the women and they betrothed them. They had many children with the Sclaveni women. The Avars were illiterate. No written record has been found from their culture. We know they existed because we found enough artifacts, but we did not find any documentation from them. So the Slaveni women would stay at home and they would raise the children while the Avar men would wage war. And what language would the Slaveni women teach their children? Well, their Slavonic language. So we see the spread of this Bosnian language transferred from Bosnia to the Slaveni, from the Slaveni to the Avar, and the Avar waging war all over Europe. The language spread very quickly, especially since the Avar themselves didn't have much of a linguistic tradition, certainly not written. Right? Then came the Byzantines. Okay, and I'm going through now centuries of history very quickly. The Byzantines were a kingdom that was established in Constantinople, what's known today as Istanbul, and Christianity had already been split up into the Eastern Orthodox Church that basically housed or took power east of the Drina River, and the Western Christian Church, which is known as Catholicism today, that was basically west of the Drina River. The Bosnians have a famous saying. They say, Hrišćanstvo pukla na Drina. Let me explain what that means. Roughly translated, it means Christianity broke into halves across the Drina River. And for centuries, it stayed that way. The Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodoxy could never get along. It was a struggle for power in Christendom. So Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, decided to bring these two kingdoms together. He made an alliance with the Avars, and he sent the Avars 20,000 equestrian warriors to the land of the Goths, known as Getica, and said to them, bring these Goth people into the fold of Christianity. The Goths stayed and fought. The Slaveni who were living with them scattered. They remembered what happened the last time the Avars had attacked. They didn't want to stay anymore to be the victims of the Avar invasion. So the Gothic people gave them a name. In the Goth language, they gave them the name Surboi. Surboi in Goth means people who are scattered, people who run away. From that, we developed the name Serbia, or Serbs, today. The Serbs are Slavic people. The Bosnians are not. Genetic science very clearly shows that the Bosnians are a different clad or a different class of people than the Slavs. They speak a Slavic language, but they're not Slavic by any stretch of the imagination. So now you see these two cultures forming, one in Bosnia and one in Serbia, or the land controlled by the Goths and the Serbs, what was known as Getica, and another land known as Moesia. And so when we look through the historical record, what we find is these two traditions started growing relatively independent of each other. Okay? And where we find today a lot of contention in the Balkans, and we're going to get to what the current state is and why it's so important for all of these people, is about the Bosnian language. Okay? The Bosnian language was spoken well before it was written. It was adopted by the Slaveni women and the Slaveni people, and more importantly, it was adopted by the Slavonic Church. The church, the old Eastern Orthodox Church, wanted to endear itself to the people. And so the only way they could do it is by changing their language. How many of you know of the King James Version of the Bible? Right? You know that King James had the Bible translated, right? And the reason he had it translated was so that the people could endear themselves to it, so they could understand it. And the same thing happened with the Eastern Orthodox Church. They embraced the Bosnian language so that the people would endear themselves to the church. The church spread, and so did the language. What you see here is the language known as Bosančica. It's one of the earliest forms of written Bosnian language. This is actually a charter written between the king of Bosnia and a province of Dubrovnik that he was actually protecting. It's known as the Charter of Kulinban. Bosnia finally got around to having its own kingdoms. After being invaded by European feudal occupiers for thousands of years, a native dynasty known as Kotromanic Dynasty started emerging in Bosnia. And from that, the Bosnians developed a sense of identity. Their identity was that of being from the Kotroman dynasty. Very famous kings came. They actually developed the infrastructure and much of the system of Bosnia-Herzegovina that we have even today. The roads, the pathways, the cities, a lot of this was done. A lot of good was brought around for the people. And this was one of the kings, Kulinban, who actually helped Bosnia prosper. And he looked after the safety and the security of his own people. You'll see on this coin from the time of Stepan Tomašević, part of the Kotromanic dynasty. Let me point it out to you. A shield. Okay? This shield has the lily flower in it. This is the flag you see today here. To this day, the Bosnians hold on to that identity. They're endeared to it. It's a symbol of when they were a kingdom. It's a symbol of when they had autonomy, when they had power in their own country. It's a symbol of when they were not second-class citizens in somebody else's occupied land. Let's talk a little bit about Islam and how it came to Bosnia. This is a very important segue. In the 8th century, 7th to 8th century, under the time of the Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah I was the first king of the first caliph of the Umayyad dynasty. Marwan was the second. In the time of Marwan, the caliph, emissaries went to the Caucasus Mountains, up towards the Russian republics like Chechnya, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and they took with them the notion of Islam. This is in the 8th century that I'm talking about, right? Around 730, 740 AD. And these emissaries came from the Caucasus Mountains to Bosnia, and they brought with them this idea of monotheism, that there is only one God. And in Bosnia, they spread this message, and the message was actually well received. Up to that point, the Bosnians had been in various forms of religious belief. They were primarily a fertility culture, meaning they actually worshiped their women at one point in time. If you imagine a community of humans that are growing, they're trying to survive the Ice Age. You have to protect your women, don't you? That's what allows your community to grow. They didn't have migration. There were not that many people in Europe at the time. So the Bosnians learned to revere their women. And what archaeologists and historians have found is that that genetic evidence we found of the Bosnian women not having this polymorphism, this mutation, the reason for that is because the Bosnians protected their women. They gave up their land. They gave up their material goods. They gave up their men, but they didn't give up their women. Now you have to start thinking about the type of society that was being developed in Bosnia. Bosnia was occupied more than 10 times. According to Professor Emir Ramić, 11 times Bosnia was invaded and occupied. And yet, they did not absorb any of the culture, the traditions, the language, the religion of any of their occupiers except for one. And we'll get to that one exception. So why is that the case? Well, the simple conclusion that I can come to is that Bosnians never learned to capitulate. They were occupied so many times, they were ruled by foreigners so many times, yet they never capitulated. This is going to be an important fact when we get to the present. So, yes? That's a really good question. I'm not that good with the Arabic calligraphy. Do you know?
I can read. There is Hussein and there is Ali.
Okay. So,
This is during the Khalifa,
Umayyad dynasty.
the it's close to the time where the Sandal al-Quds are.
Yeah, so this was right around the 8th century is what they believe. Okay? So this is an artifact that actually came from the Syria, right, which is where the Umayyad dynasty was. And the Syrians had moved this artifact up to the Caucasus Mountains, and it is symbolic of that. Okay? So, in Bosnia, at the time that these monotheistic believers came, there was a group of people known as Bogomil. These were immigrants to Bosnia who had come from Bulgaria. And the Bogomil actually were followers of Jesus. They were Christians, except they didn't embrace the Trinity. And so they were actually outcast from main Christendom, both Orthodox and Catholic. And when they met these emissaries from the Caucasus Mountains who talked about monotheism, they were endeared to them. They said, wow, this is very similar to our belief. And so many Bogomil started intellectually having debates and conversations with the emissaries that had come, the Muslim emissaries. But in the meantime, the Roman Catholic Church deemed those Bogomil to be outside the fold of Christianity. And in fact, the king of Bosnia, we saw him earlier, went to protect his people, including the Bogomil. So Pope Innocent III declared all of Bosnia-Herzegovina to be a heretic kingdom, accused the entire nation of heresy. The next pope, Pope Gregory IX, sent the Crusaders into Bosnia. They started slaughtering the Bogomil. The Bogomil escaped. Many went into the Dinaric Alps, into the mountains. Many also went to Anatolia. And in Anatolia, those Bogomil embraced Islam. Some 50 to 70 years later, their descendants came back to Bosnia, converted to Islam in Anatolia. And they then caused this rapid conversion of other Bogomil to Islam also. The very first conversions in Bosnia were not at the time of the Turks. It was well before the Turks had come. It was in the time of the Crusades. What you see here are markings left by the Bogomil. These are known as stechak, and the stechak is really a stone marker that indicates a burial ground of some sort. Mass graves have been found from the time of the Bogomil, which tells us that during the Crusades, heavy massacres must have taken place and mass graves created in Bosnia-Herzegovina. What we learned in 1995 that the Serbs had done in the last Bosnian War was actually a copy of what the Crusaders had done earlier. Islam came to Bosnia-Herzegovina in massive waves with the Turks, with the arrival of the Turks. Just one second, I'm just going to get caught up on my slide deck. The traders who came from Anatolia brought with them skills like hammering copper. Some of the artifacts you see here today are actually that same trade that has been carried on over the generations. They brought with them the ability and the patterns and designs to weave rugs, what Bosnians today call chilim. A chilim is a kind of a tapestry that's created, and it has very unique threads, very unique colors, distinct patterns that are authentic to Bosnia-Herzegovina. Okay? The traders shared these skills, and that brought the artisans and the craftsmen in Bosnia to convert to Islam. Then the Turks came. The Turks declared Bosnia to be a vilayet. A vilayet is a province. And they said, the Vilayet of Bosnia is going to be under the protection of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. The very first governor that was assigned to Bosnia was a man by the name of Ferhat Pasha Sokolovic. This mosque in Banja Luka is named after him. And what Ferhat Pasha Sokolovic was able to do was he was able to convince the Turks to invest heavily in Bosnia. Rather than exploit it as a colony, he convinced them to invest in it. So they built cities like Mostar and Sarajevo and Banja Luka. They built institutions, mosques, schools, hospitals, facilities to take care of the elderly. They brought the notion of banking to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Great accomplishment for somebody to go from being occupied to convincing your occupiers to invest in you. At about the same time, on the other side of Europe, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had started this thing called the Spanish Inquisition. Their goal was to purify Christendom of anybody that wasn't faithful to the Catholic Church. That included the Jews, it included the Muslims. They targeted about 150,000 people to test their faith. And the way they would test is they would torture those people. And those who didn't pass were immediately executed. And those who passed, well, they were deported anyway. We saw the first wave of migration of Jews from Andalus as part of this 15th century Spanish Inquisition. Those Jews and Muslims, the Jews known as the Sephardim or Sephardic Jews, ended up taking refuge in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as did those Muslims that had come with them. Sure. They're just telling me about time, so I have to be kind of mindful of where we are. Those Jews came to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they settled there, as did the Muslims that came with them. They brought with them a book known as the Sarajevo Haggadah. This is a unique book in that it tells the story of the exodus of Moses from slavery to Mount Sinai. And the book is written in Hebrew, but it has in it Islamic-style calligraphy. It's one of the first times that we have seen a beautiful manuscript written in Hebrew with Islamic calligraphy. I'm going to let you think about what that means and how that came about to be. Make a long story short, the book ended up in Sarajevo. And during the Second World War, the Nazis came in Sarajevo to try to get it and burn it. Their goal was to wipe Europe, clean Europe of all Jews. And one of the first places where they were successful in doing this was in the capital city of Belgrade. Belgrade had actually cleansed itself ethnically of Jews during the Second World War before Warsaw, before any other city in Europe. They had the help of the Serbs to do so. In Bosnia, the Sarajevo Haggadah was preserved by the assistant director of the National Museum. He took the book, he hid it inside his suit, and on a pretend visit to his sister, he drove it to a mountain just outside of Sarajevo, known as Trebević. And at the top of the mountain, or near the top of the mountain, there's a very small mosque. He gave the book to the imam of the mosque, and he said, please protect this book. The imam took it, and he hid it within the Qurans that were there, so that the Nazis wouldn't be able to find it. It's one of the few artifacts from Sarajevo of Judaism, Judaica, that survived the Second World War. The book was brought out after the war, and it sits in the National Museum today. It's a very important part of Bosnian culture and history to understand this. The Ottomans came, they invested heavily in Bosnia, as I said earlier. This is a very famous bridge. It's known as the Old Bridge, or Stari Most in Mostar. It was built by the Ottomans. It was destroyed in 1992 in this war, sadly. UNESCO made a project to rebuild the bridge using as many of the authentic materials and techniques as they possibly could. there's a brand new bridge that stands there. It's been memorialized and commemorated in remembrance of the war. The Turks got into trouble because they were trying to take over all of Europe. And where did they go? They ended up fighting with Austria. They ended up fighting with Hungary. And the Turkish Empire started to collapse. Bosnia being part of the Turkish Empire, the Turks started to tax Bosnia. And that taxation led to a revolt. The Turks then went to war with the Russians. And the next thing you know, Turkey was being replaced in Bosnia by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Turks fell. The Austrians took over. And to make a long story short, the Austrians ignored Bosnia as an investment and started treating it more like a colony. The Bosnians revolted, and so the Austrians set up garrisons, and the Bosnians refused to capitulate. So the Austrians went back to adopting the policy of the Turks and started investing in Bosnia. If you go to Sarajevo, you will see the old part of town. It's known as Çarşıya or Başçarşıya. It was really the Turkish quarter. And then literally, adjacent to those buildings built by the Turks are the buildings built by the Austrians. The Austrians brought the streetcar, they built a national library, they brought institutions and colleges. They also invested in Bosnia. And this endeared the Bosnians to them for a short period of time, except they didn't take care of the peasants, they didn't take care of the poor people in Bosnia. The Serbs started this thing called the secret Black Hand Society. And one of the things that this Black Hand Society did is they assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Duke, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in the streets of Sarajevo. And that brings us to about 1914, the start of the First World War. Austria invaded Serbia, attacked Belgrade, and the First World War was started. 16 million people died in that war. And some 20-odd years later, 22 years later, the Second World War happened in Europe. Sorry, a little bit ahead of myself. The Second World War happened in Europe, and we all know the story of that. Germany invaded Poland, the Russians got involved, and all havoc broke loose. During the Second World War, the Croats, who were living in Croatia and in Bosnia, sided with the Nazis. The Serbs took sides on both sides. They flip-flopped. King Paul Karađorđević, known as King Pavle I, actually spent 7 days with Hitler in Berchtesgaden. And they made a treaty with the Nazis to allow Nazi troops to go through Yugoslavia. But as the Nazis came to Yugoslavia, they collected all the Jews and they slaughtered them. The Croats also collected Serbs and they slaughtered them. They put them in concentration camps. And any Muslims that tried to help, either the Jews or the Serbs, were treated in the same way. Bosnia was one of the bloodiest fields of the Second World War. But out of all of this emerged Josip Broz Tito. Tito brought all three nations, actually all of the 6 republics of Yugoslavia together: Macedonia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo, into this thing that he called Yugoslavia, a socialist federal republic. That republic, under Tito, created the 4th most powerful army in Europe. It was an industrial powerhouse. And then Tito died in 1980, and soon after that, the republic started seceding. First Slovenia, and then Croatia, Montenegro, and finally Bosnia and Herzegovina. In each case, except for Montenegro, the Yugoslav army tried to attack the seceding republics. They first went after Slovenia, but the Slovenians outsmarted them. So then they turned their tanks on Croatia, and after that they turned the entire Yugoslav army on Bosnia. So in 1992, the Yugoslav army occupied all of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They laid the longest siege of any city in modern history. The siege of Sarajevo, 1,442 days. 360,000 people trapped in the city with no food, no ability to escape. and virtually no weapons to defend themselves. So now imagine a situation where the fourth most powerful army in Europe is attacking 360,000 civilians. And guess what? After 3 years of attack, the civilians did not capitulate. Do you remember what happened when the Avars attacked? Do you remember what happened when the Illyri attacked, when the Romans ruled Bosnia? The Bosnians never capitulated. If you're attacking a group of people who don't capitulate, what choices do you have? Extermination? That's what the Serbs did. Biological extermination. Eliminate them from the face of the world. Distort their history. Eradicate their identity. A man by the name of Ilya Garashenin was deputy minister of Serbia. He wrote a blueprint, and in that blueprint he said Bosnians don't have a national conscience, meaning they don't deserve a nation. He said they are actually they're deviant Serbs who have converted to Islam. He's defining them to be second-class citizens in their own country. Through this doctrine, tens of thousands of Serbs accepted the idea that it was okay to commit genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that's what happened from 1992 to 1995. All of the towns in Bosnia were blockaded or occupied in one way or another. In 1995, In 1995, this town, the town of Srebrenica, was attacked brutally. Boys and men, more than 8,000 of them, were separated from the women. They were taken to warehouses and they were executed. What the international court has ruled as a clear act of genocide. The bodies were buried in mass graves. They were hidden in mass graves and scattered so they couldn't be found. Today, to this day, Bosnian families go back to the valleys of this area called Podrinja, and they search for the remains of their loved ones. Each year they find somewhere between 60 to 100 bodies or remains, and they exhume them and they bring closure to their losses. Nearly every town in Bosnia had faced some form of genocide. The towns of Žepa, the towns of Goražde, Prijedor. Some courts have ruled genocide, some courts have not. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't a campaign to try to biologically exterminate the Bosnian people. Right? And the world, as you can see in the maps that I brought, knew all of this was going on. None of it was a surprise. Perhaps we claim today that it's a surprise, but it certainly didn't seem like it. The injustice that was carried on in Bosnia by tens of thousands of armed soldiers today continues because those soldiers have never been brought to justice. In fact, in 1995, the United States brokered a peace deal in Dayton, Ohio, that effectively froze the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, cryogenically froze it into two entities, one for the extremist Serbs, known as Republika Srpska, and the other for everybody else in Bosnia, including the Croats, and the Muslims, and the Jews, and the Serbs. This entity that was created, this Republika Srpska, actually is protecting those war criminals, tens of thousands of them. And there's nothing anybody can do about it. So that's the locked state of Bosnia that we have today. Now I'm going to invite our panel to come up here and speak. Okay, where are my panelists? Yeah, Nizama, Admira, and Mirza Velagic, please.